I stood by the bedroom window, my hands clasped together, and looked at the courtyard, which had long since become familiar. In this quiet, secluded corner, where the houses stood like soldiers in formation and the trees resembled ancient guardians, nothing had changed. The leaves on the trees rustled in the light breeze, and the sun danced between them, giving its gentle, warm energy to everything around. The world outside the window seemed still and peaceful, and I felt how this tranquility, like fabric, gently wrapped itself around me. My life was here, in this house, in this courtyard, in this comfort. It was a life that, at first glance, couldn't have been better. Work, family, home, the little worries that I handled with ease. Each day was filled with meaning, though it sometimes bordered on a gentle monotony. Everything was familiar. And in that, there was some kind of meaning that always gave me confidence. In those moments, I felt that I was a strong and reliable support for those around me. But as soon as I raised my eyes to assess the scene before me, something began to unsettle me. It wasn't painful, more like an odd feeling, like there was something I was missing, but I couldn't figure out what. My life had always been in order, and I was proud of that. I didn't need big changes or intense emotions. Everything I did was aimed at maintaining this comfortable balance. This was my place in the world, and I had no regrets about it. But now, standing by the window and feeling the sunlight spreading across the room, I suddenly sensed that something was missing from this harmony. I couldn't quite grasp what it was, but it was clear that this ordinary, peaceful day wasn't like all the others. Evening descended slowly, almost imperceptibly, as Jason and I had dinner at the table. The silence in the house, except for our calm conversation, felt cozy and familiar. We always knew how to find common topics to discuss, often simple things: how the day went, what needed to be done around the house, plans for the weekend. In those moments, I felt something strong and unchanging growing between us. Everything was as it should be. But then I heard Michael's voice, his brother's, coming from the next room, where he usually liked to sit in a chair and talk with Jason when he was home. I didn't think anything could draw my attention in their conversation, but Michael's words, spoken with a light laugh, suddenly struck my soul like a lightning bolt. "You don't deserve a woman like that, Jay," he said, laughing. The words were spoken casually, without any malice or condemnation, but I felt something inside me shudder. At first, I didn't even understand what had happened, why this comment resonated so deeply in me. I tried to focus on continuing the conversation with Jason, but the thought of what Michael had said wouldn't leave me. I watched as Jason continued to laugh and respond to his brother, but it seemed to me that his words, now with no particular reason, sounded like a distant and incomprehensible echo. And Michael's words, though seemingly random, felt heavy, piercing. Could it be that I really didn't deserve this? Didn't deserve to be with Jason? Didn't deserve this life? These thoughts seemed absurd, but they wouldn't leave me. Why did his words, which could have just been another joke, make me think about myself, about what I feel and think, about what's happening in my life? A small conversation, an ordinary meeting, and there it was. That feeling of emptiness, like an invisible seam that had torn through the fabric of my world. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't go away, no matter how hard I tried to forget that conversation. My life once again seemed gray and colorless, as though for a moment all the bright moments had vanished. Though nothing specific had happened, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had changed. Jason, as usual, was absorbed in his own tasks, and despite all the care and attention he gave me, I felt something fragile inside me, something I hadn't noticed in a long time beginning to break. I tried to pull myself together, to restore the usual calm, but it turned out that putting everything back to how it was would be much harder than I thought. Despite all my efforts, thoughts of Michael wouldn't leave me. These thoughts started to occupy more and more space. They weren't obvious or clear. They were something elusive, something that made me listen closely to my inner state. When Michael spoke to me, I noticed how he would gaze at me just a little longer than necessary. It was as though he was waiting for something, but I couldn't understand what. And that evening, when Jason and I were having dinner, Michael approached me again. As always, he was casual, but there was something in the way he interacted with me that was different from before. He began giving me too many compliments. Sometimes it felt like his words were more than just politeness. They were something deeper that he didn't say out loud, but I could feel. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just some change in his behavior that didn't mean anything. But it became more and more obvious, like a scent in the air that couldn't be ignored. Jason, of course, didn't notice anything. He still thought everything was fine, and I couldn't blame him for that. After all, I couldn't understand what was happening either. But the inner feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. And the more I tried to hide from that feeling, the stronger it became. Michael looked at me again, and I felt something inside me tighten. It was as if I was on the verge of understanding what was really happening, but I was too afraid to realize it. The morning that followed that strange night seemed just like all the others, cold and clear. I got up as usual and began my morning routine. Coffee, breakfast, checking my emails. But there was no longer that familiar sense of lightness that I had always loved in these rituals. Everything felt heavy, as if each movement required more effort than usual. When I came into the kitchen to set down my cup of coffee, my hands started trembling, and I didn't immediately understand why. It was such a slight tension, barely perceptible, but still palpable. I kissed Jason goodbye as always. He left for work, and I was left alone in the house, which suddenly felt foreign. Life once again seemed monotonous. The familiar things had lost their previous charm, and I couldn't shake the thought that I was standing on some kind of threshold, either at the end or at the beginning. And every time I tried to focus on something important, on work or on daily routine, I kept returning to that conversation, to Michael's look, to his words spoken so casually, as if it were not a joke, but the truth. That day, I tried to forget, to just switch off, but I couldn't. I couldn't work. I couldn't enjoy even simple things like a walk down the street or reading a book. All I felt was this strange, confused sensation that maybe I was missing something. But what? Michael seemed to be with me all the time, within my thoughts, in the shadows, as if his presence in my life had become inevitable, and I couldn't escape it. I tried to behave normally, but the feeling that I was missing something never left me. All these strange conversations and looks directed at me. They had become part of something bigger, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Something had changed inside me, and I couldn't understand what exactly. But I sensed that deep down I was already heading towards something, and that path might take me somewhere I wouldn't be able to return from. The morning came, offering no promises of anything special, but it turned out to be different. When I was about to go for a walk, I noticed Michael standing at the door. He suggested we walk through the park, as if nothing had happened, as if everything were as it had been before. His suggestion didn't surprise me, but inside, I felt a strange confusion. Why did I agree? Why today? We walked through the park slowly, and the air was so fresh that it felt like it could wash away all my thoughts. It was an ordinary walk, nothing unusual, except for the glances, the words he spoke. His voice was soft, and he seemed to watch me more carefully than usual, as if he were searching for something in me that I hadn't yet found myself. "You look tense," Michael said when we reached a bench and sat down. He said it as though I could answer, as though I were open to such questions. But it was too personal a question. I felt that. His gaze was too intense, and his questions were too precise. I didn't know what to say. "No, everything's fine," I answered, trying to hide my feelings. But Michael didn't take his eyes off me, and his attention became even more insistent. He kept asking questions, not about work or the weather, but about me as a person. He asked about my feelings, what was bothering me, how I saw my life. I couldn't understand what he wanted from me. Everything seemed casual and innocent, but I felt that this was more than just a walk. His words hit the mark, making me think about things I hadn't even realized. And suddenly, in that moment, I understood. Michael knew me better than I knew myself. He asked questions I wouldn't even dare ask myself. I wanted to leave, to say I needed to go home, that this wasn't something I should be doing, but I couldn't. I felt how his presence took hold of me, how his words wrapped around me. There was neither fear nor irritation, only a strange emptiness that I couldn't deal with. And perhaps that emptiness was the answer. Seeing that I couldn't escape his attention, Michael continued. And I realized that this walk would no longer be like any of the others. It was a new step in the path I feared, and at the same time, awaited. After the walk with Michael, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. We parted ways as though nothing had happened, but inside, a storm raged. What once seemed ordinary and simple now took on a strange tint. I tried to return to my usual life, pretending that everything was fine. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was the same as before, the more I felt that something deep inside me had shifted. It was as if Michael had become the one to uncover something within me that I hadn't noticed. His words, his attention, they were like a quiet crack in my perception of the world, through which doubts I had never noticed began to seep in. He didn't try to manipulate or pressure me. He simply asked questions that left an indelible mark. And now it was hard to regain my confidence. When we returned home, I couldn't look at Jason the same way. His presence became both soothing and alienating. I saw his care. I heard his voice. But something had changed between us. I couldn't return to the way I had felt before. Couldn't forget Michael. Couldn't shut off the thoughts his presence in my life now stirred up. It wasn't about attraction. It wasn't about physical desire. I couldn't even call it feelings that were usually defined as romantic or deep. It was something else. Something that just wouldn't let me rest. It was the sense that between Jason and me, something was missing. Something invisible had started to vanish. And it wasn't directly related to Michael, but his presence had become the catalyst that led me to realize that something inside me had changed. When I tried to think about it, I became afraid. I was scared to admit it to myself. I tried to return my life to the path I had been on before, but no matter how hard I tried, I could no longer ignore the cracks that had appeared in my reality. And the more I tried to ignore them, the deeper they became. Michael had become the person with whom I could no longer be myself. Not because he did anything, but because he had opened something within me that I was afraid to find. When Jason suggested spending the weekend at the cottage, I felt a strange unease in my chest. My intuition told me this would not just be a weekend away, but a test that would lead to something important, yet completely unknown. However, I couldn't turn down the offer. It made too much sense. Time to escape the city bustle, spend time with family, breathe in fresh air. After all, how could I complain about an imperfect weekend when everything was supposed to be perfect? But despite all my outward confidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip might intensify my emotions and put me in front of a choice I didn't want to make. It was a strange dissonance. Everything was so familiar, yet at the same time, so foreign. We went, as planned, but I constantly felt an invisible weight pulling me down. When we arrived at the cottage, everything looked just like before. The house surrounded by forest, cozy evenings by the fireplace, stars overhead. But something inside me was wrong. Everything around me was filled with a silence that seemed to press down, and in that moment, I realized that Michael was present in every corner of my mind. It was as if his invisible shadow had followed us here. I couldn't shake the thought, couldn't find a way to rid myself of him. And with each passing day at the cottage, the thought grew more persistent. Jason didn't notice anything strange. He was enjoying his time with the family, peaceful walks, time by the fireplace. He was just as he had always been, caring, attentive, loving. But it didn't calm me. I continued to think about Michael, and his attention to my feelings kept swirling in my head. All of it became unbearable, and I could no longer avoid thinking about what was happening between us. At night, when we sat in the dining room by the fireplace and Jason was telling another story from work, I felt his gaze. It was Michael's gaze, quiet and elusive, that wouldn't let me rest. It felt like he was right there. Or maybe it was just me feeling his presence in the air. We spoke about various things, but I noticed how Michael again turned to me with those same deep looks as before. It felt as though his words were different, like overheard thoughts, like something that should have remained unsaid but hadn't. I couldn't understand what exactly he was trying to say, but the emotions I felt became more intense than ever. It was as if this entire weekend was just an excuse for me to finally realize that I couldn't continue living without making a decision. Michael had become the source of my confusion, and this weekend, its culmination. With every look, with every question, with every word, I felt myself losing control. And if before I could have told myself that these were just words, just fleeting moments, now I knew. I could no longer avoid what was happening. One evening, when it had already gotten dark and we were sitting by the fireplace, the atmosphere was broken by a silence. Jason was talking about plans for the summer, as always, eagerly emphasizing family matters and other concerns. But I barely took in his words. Something strange hung in the air. It was as if this moment itself was too important to simply pass by. I sat with him, smiling, occasionally nodding in response. But the feelings I had been trying to suppress kept resurfacing over and over. Michael, sitting next to me, remained silent. But I felt how his gaze kept drifting toward me, how his presence pressed on me more and more. The room was warm from the fire, but suddenly I felt cold. I felt his attentive eyes, slightly tired but full of something incomprehensible, touching my soul. I knew this moment couldn't be accidental. He didn't speak loudly. He spoke in a way that forced me to listen with particular attention. "You've always been like this, haven't you?" He asked, as though it was a conversation about the past, not about what was happening now. But in his voice, I detected something else. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't ordinary interest. It was like a quiet storm, lurking, waiting to take me. Something in his words made me feel the ground beneath my feet begin to quietly shift, as if this house, which had been so cozy and secure, suddenly became empty and cold. I felt his gaze on me, and a sense of unease washed over me, as though these words weren't just questions, but an attempt to touch something I had long hidden from everyone, even from myself. I couldn't hide it any longer. What I was feeling had become too obvious. Michael didn't try to explain anything. He simply looked at me and quietly continued. "You keep so much inside, but I think you shouldn't hide it." My fingers clenched as I felt all these hidden emotions begin to break free. I tightened my fists, but I still couldn't stop the flow of thoughts. My inner world, which I hadn't thought about for so long, was now vividly and clearly showing itself. I could no longer avoid the questions that Michael had raised. And with each of his glances, I realized that this storm of emotions inside me was not just a coincidence. Jason didn't notice anything strange in Michael's behavior. He kept talking about his work, but for me, this evening had become something much more difficult. The storm of feelings I had long tried to suppress finally burst into my life. And now I couldn't ignore it. This storm could no longer be stopped. With each passing moment, the tension in the room grew, and despite my efforts to hold myself together, I could feel something important shifting inside me. I couldn't just forget. I couldn't just keep living as if nothing had happened. Now everything had become clear, and I couldn't turn away from it. I could no longer ignore what was happening inside me. My thoughts were no longer organized. The internal conflict grew like a snowball, and I didn't know how to stop it. Every glance from Michael, every word of his, which seemed so innocent and simple, began to weigh on me, making me doubt myself and my place in this life. Something was wrong, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I tried to convince myself that this was just a trick of the mind, that I was exaggerating, that perhaps Michael didn't mean anything special. But every time I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, his presence, his attention, his words came back to me with renewed force, like a constant background that wouldn't let me rest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something connected me to this person, and I couldn't understand what it was. I couldn't explain why his gaze made my heart beat faster, why I felt that chill whenever he came near me, as if we were standing on the edge of something important and inevitable. Again and again, I tried to return to normal life, to the feelings I once had. But now, when I looked at Jason, I couldn't escape the thought that something invisible was pulling me toward someone else. Everything in my life seemed to be in its place, but I could no longer believe that. I caught myself wondering if, perhaps, I wanted to step toward this unusual, to what seemed forbidden to me. But what was it? Was it desire? Or something much deeper? I couldn't understand. Each time I tried to stop this flow of thoughts, when I told myself that I should be grateful for my life, for my husband, for everything I had, I only felt worse. I felt that with each passing day, my inner world was becoming more unsteady, that I was losing the clarity that had once been mine. It was terrifying. I was trapped in my own feelings. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at a crossroads, and one wrong move could change everything. But what did I want? What was I searching for? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with all of this? Michael was near again, and I once more felt his gaze piercing deep into my soul, forcing me to tear myself between what I knew and what I felt. Night fell, and I was left alone in the silence of the house. Jason had gone to the bedroom, exhausted after a long day, and I sat on the couch, consumed by thoughts that wouldn't let me go. It felt like a trap, and I couldn't escape. The internal conflict that had tormented me for so long suddenly became clear and inevitable. I tried to find answers in my own feelings, but I couldn't put them into words. Then I felt the doors in my mind opening wider, and I realized that it was no longer possible to avoid the reality I didn't want to acknowledge. With every glance, with every moment I spent near Michael, I felt that I was no longer the person I used to be. Something had changed, and now I stood at the threshold of something I couldn't stop. Late at night, when I was trying to fall asleep, the door to the room opened quietly. I looked up and saw Michael. He entered the room without knocking, as if he had known all along that I would be here, alone. He didn't say a word, but his presence was almost tangible. I felt the air in the room change, becoming denser, more tense. "We need to talk," he said softly, almost whispering, but I heard something decisive in his voice, something that told me that now we couldn't avoid this. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew that this conversation was inevitable, and despite all my attempts to close myself off, to hide in my familiar life, I couldn't turn away. I looked into his eyes, and in that moment, it was clear that we both knew. It was already too late. "You feel it," he continued, stepping closer, his words calm, but I could sense the tension behind them. "You know that we're both standing on the edge of something, and it's impossible to stop." I tried to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't find an explanation for what was happening. My heart beat so loudly that I felt like I couldn't breathe. I tried to convince myself that this was just an illusion, that this shouldn't be happening. But his words, his gaze, they were the truth that didn't need proof. I knew that this moment was decisive. Everything that had happened before now seemed insignificant because we both stood on the threshold of something that would change everything. I tried to hide, tried to reclaim myself, my old life. But in that moment, I realized I couldn't go back anymore. The morning after that night was foggy, as if the world itself was trying to hide the truth from me. I woke up feeling a weight in my chest, as if everything that had happened had left an indelible mark, and now I couldn't erase it. Michael and I didn't speak anymore. He left the next morning, quietly packing his things as if it had already been decided. I couldn't find the words, couldn't understand exactly what had happened, but I knew. This was the end. Jason returned to his usual routine. He noticed that I had changed, but didn't ask any unnecessary questions. We continued living as if nothing had happened. I went back to my usual duties, but even doing them felt meaningless. I knew I couldn't continue like before. Something in my life had already changed, and now I couldn't return to the way things were. Every time I looked at Jason, I felt the emptiness growing inside me. Not because I didn't love him, but because something important had left with Michael. And although I tried to convince myself that this was just a temporary state, that time would heal the wounds, I knew that these feelings wouldn't just disappear. I couldn't forget them, couldn't erase that moment at the cottage, that look, those words. The farewell with Michael had been strange. There were no loud words, no confrontations. He just left. And now, with him gone, I felt that maybe I should leave everything behind. But the feeling that I had lost something important never left me. All those questions that I couldn't answer kept spinning restlessly in my mind. We continued living our life, and I tried to return to the state I was in before all of this. But I already knew that I would never be able to bring things back to the way they were. Something inside me had changed forever, and I couldn't hide it from myself. When Michael left, I felt that something bigger than just his physical presence had gone with him. I couldn't find the answer to my questions, but I felt that my relationship with Jason would never be the same. And despite all the attempts to return to the past, I knew it was gone. Saying goodbye to Michael was like saying goodbye to a part of myself, a part of what had once felt close and familiar. And now I stood before the task of understanding who I truly was and what I needed to move forward. It was a goodbye, not illuminated by the light of consolation, but leaving an indelible mark in my heart. Michael left. It was such an obvious and simple fact that there was neither pain nor bitterness. He just left. But I stayed. And with each day, as I woke up and began a new day, I felt that deep inside me, at the very core of my soul, something could not return to its place. Life went on, but it was no longer the same existence as before. In the silence of my home, in the routine of daily chores, I sensed that there was something in the world that I could no longer ignore. Michael had left, but he had left something more than just his presence behind. I felt it, like a mark in the sand, which, despite the passage of time, is still visible even when the person is far away. Jason continued to live as usual, but I could no longer be the same for him. We still did everything that needed to be done. Worked, cooked dinners, took care of the house. But between us, something invisible had appeared. And it wasn't related to Michael. It was about me. About what I had realized I needed to understand about myself. I often sat alone, trying to gather my thoughts. Sometimes I walked through the park I knew so well. I watched the people passing by, their world, and more I felt alien to it. I didn't know what I needed, what was important to me. I was so tangled in my feelings that I couldn't even explain to myself what had happened or why it had left such a mark. Time passed. I asked myself questions more and more often. Could it be that everything that had happened was just part of a journey I needed to take in order to understand who I really was? Was it a test that allowed me to see myself in a new light? And what if all these years I had been living with the illusion that all my feelings and desires had to fit some kind of standard? But above all, one question troubled me. What do I truly want? Sometimes it seemed that I already had the answer to that question, but every time I faced new doubts, new uncertainties. And I knew that I couldn't continue living in this state of indecision. I had to find my way. Jason continued to care for me, and I loved him. But I felt that it wasn't enough. I couldn't be the person I once was, because now, thanks to what had happened, I realized I wasn't that person. I was different. Saying goodbye to Michael wasn't the end of the story. It became the beginning of the path I had to walk to find out who I really was and what I needed in order to feel alive again. And while I couldn't predict what would come next, I knew that now I had gained that important clarity. What I needed was not to be tied to the past, but to learn to live in the present without forgetting who I truly was.